this tariff policy that's been rolled out by President Trump. It's been something that has a lot of people sort of in a tailspin because I don't really think that people are understanding it from the perspective of the economy. They say Trump is just lashing out. He's fighting on behalf of workers, but perhaps he's misguided. What is your response and what has your view been of the policy as it's rolled out?
Well, I start with the definition of the problem because I think one of the most important things that President Trump has brought to all sorts of areas in American politics is focusing on things that are really wrong in this country that have gone unaddressed for so much time. And globalization is a perfect example. For the last 30 years, we've had economists and politicians saying, we just need more free trade. We just need to embrace China, and promising that was going to create more good American jobs, promising that was going to be good for American industry. And it was not. It has been, I think, incredibly harmful. It has hollowed out our manufacturing sector. It has cost millions of jobs. And we are finally now admitting that. And I think President Trump has done an incredible service in saying this cannot go on. We really need to change how the international economic system works. We need to make sure it actually works for the United States. And as importantly, something most politicians won't do, he's saying, look, this is going to have some costs, right? It is going to require some sacrifice in the short run to dig out of this hole, and that is worth doing. And so I think having an administration willing to push in that direction is incredibly important. And then you get to the sort of details. And I think, I have some concerns about some of the details. We can talk about, what is exactly the right way to go after this. But it is just incredibly important that we finally are going after it.
And so, right, the idea being that is there's a lot of people who have been saying that the status quo, that the concerns of so much of America, it doesn't really matter, that everything's certainly fine, that people are just, everything's sunshine and roses. But in reality, the status quo does have these massive structural issues to it. And like it or lump it, what President Trump is at least attempting to do is address these types of problems that have been going on for far too long. Again, the hollowing out of middle America, this massive overspending, monetary policy where it's been go to the Fed whenever there's an issue, inject that liquidity into the market. And at some point, this was always going to come to a halt. At some point, this debt was going to have to be paid. And this is the way that President Trump and his team have decided to come together and face it, but actually address something. Whereas the previous administration, of course, were, sitting there and lying to you blue in the face, telling you that nothing was wrong.
That's right. And you see that in these sort of fights, certainly among economists, there are so many people who will just say, well, look at gross domestic product, GDP, it's gone up a lot. So obviously free trade has been great. Or, look at how much stuff we have. Look at how cheap big TVs are. They really do think that the sort of definition of flourishing is just how much stuff you have. And look, I like stuff too. I don't think we should be living in log cabins in the woods. But I do think we have to think a lot harder about some of these trade-offs and recognize that there's more to life than just as much cheap stuff as you can get from China. Whether or not there are good jobs in communities across the country that allow people to support families, whether or not we can make the things we need in this country to defend ourselves, to be resilient in the case of some sort of global crisis. We gave that all away. And thank goodness we will hopefully start to get some of it back. If we think this sort of liberal world order system, first of all, even if it was serving the U.S. well at one point, is not serving it as well anymore. Second of all, to some extent, may just be going away anyway. China is now rising as a peer competitor. The U.S. cannot be a unipolar hegemon like it was when the Cold War ended. So if we accept that things are going to change, we should have a perspective on what we want to follow. Mm-hmm. And something that I've been writing about a lot is trying to interpret and decipher what that might look like. Because again, it's a very fair critique. They have not been as clear about it as we should want them to be. What I think we should want, mm-hmm. and what, like I said, folks in the administration like a Marco Rubio or a Scott Bessent, who I think do write and speak thoughtfully about it, have pointed toward, is the idea that we absolutely want a strong economic and security alliance. It's not going to be the whole world because China is going to have its own sphere as well. Mm-hmm. But what we want to have within our sphere is a few things that in the past the U.S. didn't necessarily ask for. We're going to want balanced trade, where in the past we were happy to let the manufacturing go elsewhere. we're going to want others to essentially own their own defense burdens. That doesn't mean we're not partnering and working together, but that everybody takes primary responsibility for their own defense.
And these are, again, just some of the things that you've been talking about here on the program, laying it out. This idea that it feels to me almost like it's sort of like those old studies that you read about imperial overstretch of the Roman Empire or something like that. Whereas to say, we're paying for the defense of so many areas that are far beyond the core of our heartland, that it's actually the heartland itself that is paying the price as we overextend ourselves. Does that kind of get to what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, because this is the sort of imperial plan that the U.S. has pursued. After the end of World War II, and then even more so after the end of the Cold War, we really were the hegemon. I mean, in the 1990s, it was the U.S.'s world, and the calculation that we made was we benefited from that. And that if we had to pay more for other people's defense, but it meant that we were the only incredibly powerful military, that was a good trade. If we had to let manufacturing go to other countries, but as a result, they were friendlier to us, as a result, they sort of kept peace and friendly economic environment, then that was a good trade. And it's an interesting question whether it was even a good trade back then. But the reality is that it is certainly not a good trade now, that the costs have really built up for the United States, the benefits have really gone down, and that as China rises in the world, even if we liked that world, we just can't have it anymore. The world is going to be different. And sometimes it takes some policies that cause disruption to move in response to that, to not just wait until you're overtaken by events, but to actually take the initiative in moving toward the new system that would benefit our country.
I think what's interesting is you describe Liberation Day almost like D-Day, in the sense that you get the shock and awe, but also the understanding that D-Day was merely day one of a longer campaign.
Yeah, we've really been talking, so far about the idea here, what's really wrong, why we need to change course. And the importance of having an administration and a president that are actually, see the problem and are prepared to do something about it. I think that being said, there's a lot of fair criticism of some of the details of what they're doing, particularly because if you're going to do this kind of move that does have a lot of costs before you get the benefits, it's really important to try to keep those costs as low as possible and make sure you get those benefits as high as possible. And so what I talk about in the piece is just a few places where I think there's really good opportunity to correct course. One of the most important is just the idea of phasing in some of these tariffs. We have, especially with all these countries that we have been trading, in ways that really support their manufacturing. That's what we've been doing for the last 50 years. And it's entirely fair to say, hey, we actually would like to make a change. I think it's a lot harder to just say, and you face a very large tariff starting today. Now let's talk about what you might change. That creates a lot of cost, a lot faster than they could possibly do anything. So one thing that I suggest is, look, especially all the countries that have clearly come forward and say, yes, we understand things need to change, we're ready to negotiate. It would make a lot more sense to say, okay, we have a 6-month period here to negotiate. If we are not happy with the offers on the table, then these tariffs start to go into effect 6 months from now. And if over the 6 months after that, you don't get where you need to be, then the full value of the tariff is in place. And that would both give a chance to make progress without cost, and it would give all of the businesses that have built up these supply chains, that have made these investments in the past, time to start adjusting themselves. We want them to start investing in America, and we want them to start today. But starting an investment in America today doesn't mean your factory starts running today. We do need to account, I think, for the fact that there is going to be a transition period here.
No, I think that's certainly right. Now, I wanted to key in as well on your section on China, because you have an interesting idea, sort of a 3-step plan for the tariffs on China, but ultimately would culminate in just a real disentanglement of the U.S. and Chinese economies, and ultimately with the revocation of China's permanent national, permanent normal trade relations status and even most favored nation, which is something that it's really the backbone of all of globalism. Do you think that's achievable?
I think this is one of the most achievable things. The original sin, in a sense, of globalization was when we granted China PNTR status in 2000, 2001 time. That's what allowed them to join the WTO and opened up the floodgates of offshoring. We should do the reverse. We should recognize that China is an adversary. It is not a market economy, and we should not have free trade with it. And this is a surprisingly really an idea that has a surprising consensus. It is a bipartisan recommendation of the House Committee on the Communist Party of China. It is a bipartisan recommendation of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And there is already bipartisan legislation in Congress to do this. And by the way, one of the co-sponsors of it was Marco Rubio, who is now the Secretary of State. So if you were to embrace that approach, first of all, you could go through Congress, which would make it permanent, right? If we actually change this stuff in the law, everyone will know we mean it. This is for good. Whereas I think one challenge with just doing it with action from the president is people are always going to wonder, well, what if he changes his mind tomorrow? And then the second thing I think is that legislation that they have has this very thoughtful sort of phased in approach where they say, look, we want to get really all the way up to 100% tariff. What Trump is now threatening for China basically is in the legislation. We want to be at 100% for what we consider critical goods. And that would effectively cut off imports of those goods. But what it does is it has a schedule of how to go there over 5 years. And if we were to pass that law, there is no question that those tariffs would in fact be going into effect. Businesses would have to move out of China.